So to begin today, there have been a lot of discussions about AI this week. So before jumping into my topic, I just want to take the opportunity to give a brief tribute to two developers. One of them is Peter Eckersley, who passed away last year. Did anyone work with Peter? Has anyone worked with Let's Encrypt? Yeah, so Peter led the charge for Let's Encrypt with the EFF. He then went on to be Director of Research for the Partnership on AI. Peter and I were both graduates of the University of Melbourne, where we met back in the 1990s. He was very enthusiastic about ethical issues and the social impact of our work in technology. And you could see that shining through in his efforts with Let's Encrypt, for example, which many people are familiar with even long after he's passed. So it was very tragic. He died very suddenly, having treatment for cancer last year. And there have been many tributes online. One of Peter's last blogs is quite interesting. His server, he didn't have any arrangements in place to sustain his blog after his death, which is quite sad because he ran a crowdfunding campaign to cryogenically freeze his brain, which was successful. Hopefully they'll be able to bring his brain back in with technology in the future. But his blog, however, was not sort of sustained in any way, and it's disappeared, but it's still available in archive.org. So one of his last blogs was about Google should not help the US military to build unaccountable AI systems. This is quite fascinating because right under Peter's nose, students at the University of Melbourne were working on this tool called Jack, on a testing system for Jack in 1999. And about 5 years later, this Jack thing appeared in the first autonomous UAV flight, so the first autonomous drones. You can find this newsletter. There's a link from my blog to this newsletter on the Pentagon website. So you can see this student project from Jack ended up in there. So Peter and I were both appointed as the student representatives on the university's IT committees, and I think I may have been one of the students who inadvertently ended up involved with this at the same time. The funny thing about this, of course, is it was tested at Greytown. Greytown is named after an Irish judge. So these unaccountable drones are executing people without the involvement of a judge or a jury. So all I can say is have a look at Peter's blog. I'll get this into my tribute, a link to the archive.org snapshot, so that people can find it. The other developer I just want to give a brief tribute to was one of the leading developers of the Debian installer. Yesterday was the 30th anniversary of Debian. Who uses Debian? Yeah, so many people have used Debian. Many people have heard of the suicide of Debian's leader or founder, Ian Murdoch, which was a few years ago at Christmas. As it turns out, there was a much more serious suicide, a volunteer who worked on the installer the night before the Debian anniversary. So it was the 15th of August, 2010. And that's Franz Popp. So this is a picture of Franz at FOSDEM. So anyway, I don't want to say too much about it, but because one of the brilliant things about Franz is he's actually written quite a lot himself, and many of those emails are coming out. So you can read it in his words. If you look, you'll find my interpretation of what he has to say. But I'll leave that up to you. You can read his own words about the issue, about the pressure from Ubuntu and things like this on the volunteers in Debian. Franz was a volunteer, and I think that's really important to remember, that free software and open source software depends a lot on volunteers, and Franz really was a volunteer, and you'll see that coming through in his own words about volunteers working alongside people from a range of different companies. So this website, for those who want to find it, it's simply called debian.day. And it's just an interesting coincidence that Arthur gave a great talk yesterday on mental health, which coincides with both the Debian Day and also Franz's decision to end his life, which is an incredibly sad decision. Arthur left us with a slide about burnout, and that might be a useful point of reference for anyone who does read over the messages from Franz, would be to evaluate them against some of these criteria and see what was going on in that community. So yeah, Franz has done a huge amount of work. You can find videos, you can find a lot of other tributes from different people over the years. So, nonetheless, the topic today is logging. And it is interesting that logging often helps us diagnose problems, and what Franz has left us is like a huge log file in Debian private. So we're going to jump into logging now in a more formal and technical sense. Yeah. So monitoring and troubleshooting distributed RTC applications, and the focus of this talk is not the full gamut of monitoring solutions, but mainly the logging aspect of monitoring. Yeah, so during the credit crisis, I was working in Barclays in London, in Canary Wharf. We had a whole team dedicated to monitoring. So for every different type of monitoring, for log monitoring, for performance metrics, for service availability, for each of these things, there were at least one developer just on that topic. So I was on the performance metrics as opposed to the logging. But the talk today is about logging. Yeah, so in the beginning, VoIP systems or RTC systems were quite simple. You might have a very simple network topology with a single monolithic Asterisk server, and you would connect your phones to that single process, and that process would do everything. So if you had a problem, you could log into the console and see the logs in one place. Whether it's Asterisk or whether it was FreeSwitch, which came along a little bit later, you can do the same thing. You can just log into the console and see the logs from all the phones that are connected to that server. Or you could go to the file system, you could find them in var log Asterisk or var log FreeSwitch, which is a pretty standard thing where most system administrators would know to look there. But things have evolved. With WebRTC in particular, you can have multiple processes, each writing log files in different places. Many of the processes don't have a console, like the Asterisk or FreeSwitch. You have different ways to access logs, but if you look at things like turn servers, they don't have a console where you can log in and troubleshoot them. They just have a log file. Well, you might even find that one process is logging to a file and another process is logging to syslog, and they're all going to different places. So here we've got the example. There's a web server that is serving up the JavaScript to the clients. You've got a SIP proxy that is handling the WebSocket connections, and then you've got a turn server. So that's a third process that's involved. And this is still a very basic WebRTC setup. in practice, you might have media servers and conferencing servers and maybe a dozen different processes. You might have authentication servers and databases all tied up in this WebRTC system that you're building. So who had fun last night in the casino night? Yeah, so what we're doing here is taking all these log files from different processes and trying to work out how do we combine them. Now, you don't want to shuffle them up randomly, like what they do in the casino when the blackjack dealer or the poker dealer is shuffling the cards. They all get jumbled up deliberately. But with log files, it's quite the opposite. We want to order them and maybe filter them so that when we merge logs from different processes, we put every entry in time order. And an interesting point there is hopefully if your processes don't run on the same server, hopefully the clocks are synchronized as well, because otherwise it can be hard to get the log entries in time order. Text-based logs are the default. They're very common. One problem we had in reSIProcate, which is one of the projects I do a lot of work on, we log entire SIP messages, and SIP messages include new lines. So logging messages that include new lines is really bad for text-based logging, because then you cannot easily filter by the severity or something else. It just becomes a huge mess. So you can read those logs manually by scrolling through them with a text editor, but if you want to use tools to process them, it's really painful. So that's one of the reasons that I came into this topic. If you move on to a structured logging format, you can embed those multi-line messages into one of the fields with a \n, like new line separator, between the quotes. So you can actually have multi-line log messages in a single JSON object. On top of that, you can have all these other attributes that are clearly, it's obvious what they are from the names of those attributes, like the date and the severity in this case. So it's much, much easier for tools to process, to do filtering or to merge them, to put them back together in time order. This is a very trivial example where most of the attributes are missing and where the date is just the date. I have left out the time and the seconds and everything else. So a few years ago, there was this effort called CEE, and it was abandoned. But nonetheless, they left all the documentation online. And what they did with CEE is they gave us a list of those attributes, so the names of the different attributes. And they also described what the values mean, like the error, for example. So you don't want two different applications having different definitions of an error. It's better if every application has a similar perception of when to use error. So CEE gave us these things. So for me, the reason to use something like CEE is because it's better than reinventing the wheel. There are a number of projects out there that have actually tried to do JSON-based logging, and they've created different names for some of the attributes. And then you no longer have the ability to mix and match logs from different processes, which is unfortunate. So if everyone agrees to use the same abandoned CEE standard, then at least we're using the same thing. The fact that it's abandoned is not important if it actually works for what we want to do. So Kamailio was one example that had a bespoke JSON schema. I think it was in 2020. But I've contributed a patch there to support CEE, and I think that's been accepted for some time now. I think Asterisk also has something. Does FreeSwitch have JSON logging? Yes, it does. And is it a custom format as well? Yeah, so you could customize it to CEE if you wanted to. Yeah. Yeah, so there are a lot of tools that seem to work with CEE. There are a lot of documents, so people have written blog posts about some project they did with CEE. Some of these tools are outside of our own domain in real-time communications. So people have written about using CEE with their Apache web server. And it just coincides with what we do with WebRTC, that we also use web servers. So we can benefit from their documentation instead of writing our own. And if the CEE doesn't do something you want, you could add extra fields. Let's say you want to log SIP dialog ID for every log message where it's relevant, you could add a field for that. That would be really useful for some things. For example, correlating the log messages with other entries in a system like Homer, you need to have those SIP dialog ID details. So here's a summary of the progress adding CEE to different applications. So OpenSIP has it. They added it just before the OpenSIP summit in May. reSIProcate has had it for more than a year now. Kamailio has it. Gstreamer, I submitted a patch for that. Kurento, I submitted a patch. With Asterisk, I've created a bug report which links to the relevant code, so it's like a beginning of that. So I need to update these slides with details about FreeSwitch implementation as well. Now, is anyone here involved with Gstreamer or Kurento development? If you are in contact with any of the developers, and if you'd like to use this feature, please ask them to merge the patch, because that would be really useful to have the logs from the media stack merged with the logs from the signaling processes like the SIP proxy or FreeSwitch or Asterisk. So you don't need a JSON library to write CEE log messages. In fact, it's to be avoided. If you use a library, then that's going to create more work for people who have to build packages or something of your application. And the library could have bugs in it. It's not actually necessary to use a library. You can use any string manipulation commands to just write the JSON out to the log destination, whether you're sending them to syslog or to a file. You can just construct the JSON CEE as strings. If you're sending to the syslog API from whether it's from your own custom code or whether you're modifying one of the open source projects, and if you want to send to syslog, you have to remember to put this prefix. It's in bold here. You use the regular syslog command, but you insert @CEE:. It's important to do that from the application, because the logging process, like the rsyslog daemon, it will see that and it will handle that in the JSON module. So it's a little thing that you just have to remember to include that. I've written a blog post to go with this, and it also summarizes these key points for developers. So here's another interesting trick. What if you've got a binary process from a vendor and you cannot modify their logging code? Well, it turns out you can. You can use LD preload to insert a custom handler for the syslog API call. So there's an example of this in GitHub. Look for log reader. I've linked to this from my blog about the topic as well. So the benefits of JSON CEE, you get the same field names, or attribute names, and you get the same semantics. So error means the same thing in different applications. The timestamps are presented the same way from different applications. So you only have to write one parser for the JSON CEE. Yeah. As critical mass grows, more developers will log things in JSON, and at the same time, there'll be more reason for people to build tools that can read those logs. So it grows together. So if you are doing some new project and you're deciding how to log from the beginning, it's very easy to just start using JSON from the beginning. If you've got existing projects, you might not want to retrofit them right away, but if you see an opportunity to do it, it's useful. I'll just give an example here of a tool that can use this data already. The OpenSearch, which is similar to ElasticSearch and Kibana, they had their licensing issues. So I think it was Amazon forked ElasticSearch, and now they've got OpenSearch. So they're much the same thing, but there are existing demonstrations of how you can read JSON logs into OpenSearch and how you can examine them with the Kibana or the OpenSearch dashboard. You can present them, you can present statistics like this. You can analyze line by line. You can filter the lines. You can see that the dashboard is putting the attribute names in bold. So these tools already exist. So as soon as you start writing your logs in JSON CEE, you can immediately use these tools. So that's the presentation. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Are also welcome on any of the things I've discussed. If people have competing ideas, but I don't mind.
We do have a microphone at the back, and so if people have questions, just raise your hand, and you'll be able to direct them to Daniel via the audio equipment in the room. I'm not seeing a lot of hands right now, Daniel.
Okay, very good. Well, it was good to meet you all here again at ClueCon, and I think we've saved some time for the next speaker, which is great. So, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Daniel.